The Lacus crystalline was not known for its warmth. It was a vast, deep expanse of freshwater, perpetually shaded by the steep, pine-laden mountains that ringed its basin. The water, though clear in composition, always held a hue of profound, unsettling indigo, a mirror to the perpetual twilight of the surrounding peaks. Elian, who was 11 years old and felt much older, knew this water intimately, though he had never touched it directly. He lived suspended above it, inside the structure known only to him as the Observatorium. The Observatorium was a monument to fragility, a testament to desperation and Elian's entire world. It was a floating house, roughly 12 meters long and 6 meters wide, constructed almost entirely of heavy-gauge structural glass and thin, pale cedarwood floorboards. It was anchored loosely in the geometric center of the lake, far from any accessible shore. Every wall, from the narrow entryway to the single recessed sleeping alcove, was transparent, but the most crucial sections were the floor panels. Running down the central axis of the living area were 3 massive panels of reinforced laminated glass set flush into the cedar. These were the windows to the abyss below, the waterline only a few centimeters beneath their surface. Elian knelt now, as he did during the peak light of every afternoon, his breath fogging the cool glass momentarily before the ambient chill reclaimed it. His fingers, thin and lightly scarred from managing the few delicate interior mechanisms, traced the edge where the cedar met the glass. The air inside the observatorium was always heavy with the mingled scents of old cedar treated with oil, the metallic tang of condensation, and the faint persistent odor of static water. He was wearing 3 layers of patched wool, necessary even on the warmest days, for the glass radiated the lake's constant, profound cold. Below him, the world was alive, yet silent. The afternoon sun, having fought its way over the eastern ridge, was now directly overhead, plunging shafts of intensely filtered cerulean light straight down into the depths. This light did not illuminate the bottom, the lake was too deep, but it illuminated the upper 20 meters of the water column with startling clarity. Elian watched the motes. They were not dust. They were plankton and minute mineral particles, suspended in perfect equilibrium, catching the sunbeams like slowly descending showers of silver dust. The sensation was that of hovering inside a constantly shifting vertical shaft of blue light. He focused on the waterline. Because the observatorium was buoyant and designed to minimize drag, the glass panels offered an unnervingly clear view of the meniscus. He could see the small, rhythmic disturbances, the microscopic ripples caused by the air currents, and the imperceptible drift of the structure itself. Shh, swoosh, shh, swoosh. That soft, wet sound was the background hum of his existence. For nearly an hour, Elian remained motionless, save for the slow, regular blinking of his eyes. His gaze was trained on a specific cluster of submerged aquatic reeds, anchored perhaps 10 meters away and slightly below the plane of the house. He was looking for the tiny, silver flash of the Lacus minnows, his only reliable distraction. Loneliness was a cold, constant companion, but the water was the distraction that kept the isolation from becoming paralyzing. The water offered movement, scale, and a hypnotic repetition. He shifted his weight, and the floorboards issued a sharp, protesting creak, a sound that always sent a shudder through the glass structure, amplifying the noise until it felt like a gunshot in the silent environment. Elian froze, listening. He had trained himself to silence, but sometimes the house insisted on its own acoustics. When the silence returned, thick and cold, he settled back down. His view shifted slightly, moving further into the deeper, less illuminated zones, where the blue light began to fade into a featureless indigo void. It was in this boundary zone, where clarity yielded to shadow, that the observation began. It did not appear suddenly. It was a change in texture, a disturbance in the regular pattern of the floating particulate matter. Elian stared, his eyes widening slightly, but he did not move his head. Moving his head would introduce parallax distortion through the layered glass and the water. He held his breath, forcing his body into absolute stillness. There was a shape. It was below the waterline, maybe 2.5 meters beneath the glass floor. It was slightly elongated, irregular, and appeared to be stationary. The most immediate, jarring observation was its color, a deep, saturated ochre that seemed wholly alien against the pervasive blues and silvers of the lake. It was the color of dry, aged wood or rich, oxidized earth, a color that did not belong in the cold, living hydroscape of the lacus crystalline. Elian felt a sudden, sharp clench in his stomach, the familiar physical manifestation of deep, unexpected fear. His instinct, honed by years of solitary survival, was to retreat, to hide in the darkened alcove where the glass panels were replaced by solid cedar walls. But the sheer incongruity of the object held him captive. He watched for another minute. The object did not drift. It was clearly anchored or heavily waterlogged, its edges, blurred slightly by the water's natural magnification and movement, suggested a rectangular form, a box. The realization was a silent internal echo. It was too regular to be natural debris, too dense to be a piece of common floating rubbish. He pushed himself up slowly, articulating each joint movement with painstaking deliberation, so as not to disturb the buoyant house further. He stood over the middle glass panel, hands pressed against his hips, leaning forward. The object was still there. The light was shifting, pulling the sunbeams westward. Soon, the optimal viewing angle would disappear, plunging the area back into the deep, ambiguous shadows of the late afternoon. If he wanted to verify what he saw, he had to act now. Elian began to inventory his environment, his mind clicking through the limited resources available. The observatorium was essentially one large, continuous room, sparse and functional. Rations were stored in a shallow cupboard near the galley sink. There was a coil of unused braided hemp rope, tethering rope, stiff and thick, left by his parents, tucked into a compartment beneath the galley bench. That rope was his only potential tool for retrieval. He moved toward the galley, his small, careful steps sounding impossibly loud on the wood. He slid open the compartment cover. The rope lay coiled, smelling faintly of tar and dry heat, preserved from the lake's dampness. It was perhaps 20 meters long. To access the water, he had only one means: the central hatch. At the eastern end of the structure, near the sleeping alcove, the central glass floor panel gave way to a heavy, articulated wooden hatch secured by 2 brass lever locks. This hatch was designed for maintenance, or, as his father had once explained long ago, for resupply ingress. Elian knelt by the hatch. The brass levers were cold and sticky beneath his fingertips. He checked the perimeter seal, ensuring the integrity of the locking mechanism. This was the boundary between his safe, air-filled world and the crushing, cold indifference of the lacus crystalline. He knew the rules. The hatch was never to be opened without absolute necessity. The slightest error in deployment could compromise the buoyancy chambers or flood the interior. But the ochre box below the waterline felt like an absolute necessity. It was an intrusion into his ordered, desolate life, and therefore a possibility. He slid the first lever back. The heavy clunk of the internal mechanism resonated through the cedar, sharp and definitive. He paused, waiting for the structure to react. A shift, a list, anything, nothing. The observatorium held steady. He engaged the second lever. Clunk! The hatch remained seated firmly in the frame. Now came the difficult part, physical exertion. The hatch was weighty, designed to withstand the upward pressure of the water below. Elian had to lift it against both gravity and hydrostatics. He braced his small feet against the adjacent cedar boards, gripped the recessed handles, and pulled, slowly, steadily, using his entire body weight. The initial resistance was immense. He grunted softly, the sound muffled in the chilled air. Then, with a slow, grinding scrape, the seal broke. A rush of intensely cold air, laden with the sharp mineral smell of the deep lake, erupted upwards. The sound of the water, previously dampened and filtered, was now immediate and loud, a constant sucking lapping against the inner rim of the structure. Elian forced the hatch open until it rested vertically against the alcove wall, revealing a gaping, dark square of water below. The water surface, now visible just inches beneath the wooden frame, was dark, restless, and utterly compelling. It looked like liquid obsidian reflecting the ceiling. He moved back to the tethering rope. The ochre box, he estimated, was directly below this hatch, or close enough to be reached if he leaned out slightly. He tied a simple, heavy slipknot at one end of the rope. He needed something with mass to act as a grappling or retrieval weight. He scanned the sparse interior again. Inventory check. Rations, rope, a small kettle, and stored beneath the sleeping pallet, a stack of heavy, lead-lined ballast weights used originally for stabilization during the house's construction. He chose one of the smallest weights, a flat, rectangular piece of lead, roughly the size of his hand and surprisingly heavy. He threaded the rope securely around the lead weight, tying a series of complex, reinforced knots he had learned by practicing with useless scrap cordage years ago. He tested the knot with a sharp tug. It held. He returned to the hatch. The cold air rising from the water was now biting, stealing the warmth from his face. He lowered the lead weight into the opening. It broke the surface with a small, clean plop and disappeared immediately. Elian uncoiled the rope slowly, allowing it to feed into the water column. He felt the cold drag, the resistance of the water against the fibrous rope. 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters. He held the rope taut, positioning himself directly over the hatch, peering down through the opening. The water immediately beneath the hatch was darker and agitated, but beyond the immediate turbulence, the visibility improved. He strained his eyes, looking for the ochre shape. There it was. It appeared much larger now, magnified by the shallow depth. It was indeed a wooden box, perhaps the size of a large shoebox, constructed of thick planks and sealed seemingly by nature and water pressure. It was lying slightly tilted on a small underwater shelf of rock, or perhaps embedded in the soft silt. It looked impossibly heavy and utterly ancient. Elian had to guide the lead weight to snag the box. This required delicacy and immense patience. He let out a little more rope, then slowly began to swing the weight in a wide, controlled arc, moving the line back and forth, attempting to catch a hinge or an uneven edge of the wooden container. Minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour. The muscles in Elian's shoulders were burning with the effort of holding the damp, heavy line steady. The fear had receded, replaced by a feverish, singular focus. Catch it. He tried swinging the line from the north side, then the south. The water movements, small currents he hadn't detected before, complicated the maneuver, pulling the rope slightly off course, just as the weight approached the target. He pulled the weight back up a meter, changed the angle of entry, and dropped it again, aiming for the loop to settle over the entire box. On the 15th attempt, the swing was perfect. The lead weight descended just past the object. Elian pulled sharply on the rope, causing the slack to tighten. He felt a satisfying heavy thunk travel up the line. The rope had snagged something solid. He waited, listening for a sound of slippage or displacement. Silence. He began the slow, agonizing process of retrieval. He couldn't just haul it up. The box was waterlogged and possibly fragile. He had to pull with steady, even pressure, using the weight of the water to assist the lift, ensuring the box didn't slip free and plummet back into the blackness. Inch by laborious inch, the line shortened. The sight of the box emerging from the blue void was startling. It seemed to grow exponentially as it approached the surface. Its ochre color now revealed to be a deep, saturated mahogany, stained and mottled by years of immersion. It was secured, perhaps, by the rope having caught around a rusted metal band that ran the perimeter of the box. As the box broke the surface of the water, a new dimension of smell assaulted Elian. The heavy, sulphuric odor of deep lake mud and decay, mixed with the sharp scent of old, preserved wood. He reached down, gripping the rope tightly, and used the momentum to lever the dripping, heavy mass onto the wooden lip of the hatch opening. The water streaming from the box was instantly absorbed by the thirsty cedar floorboards. The wood itself was cold, shockingly cold, radiating the temperature of the lake's depths. Elian secured the rope around a nearby table leg, ensuring the box wouldn't slip back, then quickly moved to shut the hatch. He needed to restore the interior temperature and stop the constant, distracting rush of the water sound. He shoved the heavy wooden panel down. Slam! The splash of the closure was dramatic. He quickly engaged the two brass levers. Clunk, clunk. Silence, heavy and protective, returned to the observatorium. The only sound was the residual drip of water from the box onto the cedar. He knelt beside the treasure. The box was sealed tight, not locked, but sealed shut by the immense pressure of the water and the swelling of the wood. The surface was textured, etched with the tracks of unseen organisms that had fed on it over time. The metal band was thick, deeply rusted, almost consumed by the oxidation. Elian ran his hands over the surface. It felt strangely smooth despite the texture, polished by constant friction in the water. How long had it been down there? A year, 5 years, longer? He needed to open it. He searched for a seam, a weakness. The box was a single stubborn unit. His heart still hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the pervasive quiet. This was the first unknown variable he had encountered in his entire life within the observatorium. Everything else, the rations, the light patterns, the lake's moods, was predictable. This was foreign. He stood up and walked to the galley. He retrieved a simple, short-handled utility knife, the sharpest tool he possessed. Used mostly for cutting rope or opening the waxed paper wrapping of his dried meat rations. He returned to the box, careful not to damage the floorboards with the knife point. He wedged the blade edge into the thinnest perceptible seam between the lid and the body of the box, near a corner where the wood seemed slightly less swollen. He pressed, pushing with the flat of his palm, trying to utilize leverage. The knife blade, thin and sharp, bent slightly. The wood refused to yield. He needed a better tool for leverage. He remembered the ballast weights, still near the pallet. He grabbed the heavy lead weight he had just used and brought it back. He repositioned the utility knife, securing the tip deeper into the seam, wedging it slightly. Then, using the blunt edge of the heavy lead weight, he delivered a sharp, controlled tap against the knife handle. Crack! The sound was brittle and sharp, echoing off the glass walls. It wasn't the sound of the box breaking, but the sound of the seal yielding. A faint line of dark, foul-smelling gas, methane or trapped air, escaped from the seam. Elian pulled the knife out and inserted the flat, thick edge of the lead weight itself into the newly created gap. Using the weight as a lever, he pulled upwards, slowly, steadily. The lid gave way with a long, wet, tearing shriek of separating wood fibers. The interior of the box was revealed. It was not filled with treasure or jewels or strange, magical implements. It was filled entirely with mud and waterlogged paper. Elian felt a wave of profound deflation, an emotional plunge, matching the depth from which the box had been retrieved. All that effort, the risk, the expenditure of physical energy, for sludge. He used the tip of the knife to gingerly clear away the thick black silt coating the contents. He scooped out a large handful of the wet, heavy substance and dropped it onto a piece of old, stiff oilcloth he kept for cleaning. As the sludge was cleared, the contents began to take shape. They were indeed papers, heavily saturated and fragile, bound together by what looked like thin, rotting strips of leather. The item at the top was a journal. It was roughly A5 size, bound in what had once been dark brown leather, now almost black from water damage. The pages, visible at the edge, were thick and heavy, designed to resist ink bleed. Elian carefully lifted the entire block of papers from the box. The water poured out, smelling powerfully of lake bed. The papers felt cold and strangely resilient, preserved somehow by the anoxic conditions of the lake floor. He carried the mass to the small cedar table in the center of the structure, where the light was still strong. He laid the journal and the accompanying stack of loose letters, for they looked like letters, down, spreading them gently on a dry patch of the table. He had to dry them, quickly and gently. He fetched his wool blanket from the alcove, pulling the thick, heavy fabric across the table, creating a gentle, absorbent barrier. He placed the journal upon it. The journal was the priority. He opened the front cover with excruciating care. The paper resisted, the wet fibers sticking together. He needed to be patient, to let the ambient air slowly draw the moisture out. He waited 5 minutes, breathing shallowly, watching the paper darken where the water was most concentrated. The surface of the leather-bound cover slowly began to dull from a wet sheen to a matte, dark finish. He tried again. Inserting the tip of his knife, he separated the first page from the cover. He pulled the page back, revealing the title page. The ink, likely waterproof archival quality, was intact. Scrawled across the top, in a familiar sweeping hand, the hand of his father, which he only knew from the maintenance notes left around the Observatorium, were 2 words: Lacrimae Record, Tears Record. Below the title, the date, 5 years and 3 months ago. A profound, sickening realization flooded Elian. This journal was written just before they left. It was a record of the final moments of his parents' lives, placed in the box, weighted and submerged beneath the structure, specifically designed to withstand time and pressure. The box had not been lost debris. It was a message. A deliberate, final communication, intended to be found only if Elian stayed long enough, or perhaps only if he faced the daunting challenge of the water itself. His hands began to shake violently, not from the cold, but from the realization of the emotional density of the object before him. He was touching his parents, their thoughts, their last intentions, through this waterlogged paper. He had to read it. Now. He turned to the first page of the journal, bracing his hand flat against the damp page to prevent it from tearing as he separated it from the next. The script was tight, dense, and hurried, but perfectly legible. Entry 1. Day 0. Isolation. The air inside the observatorium is too quiet. The glass magnifies every tremor, every sigh. E sleeps. He looks impossibly small, curled under the thickest quilt. We told him we were leaving for a short survey of the northern shore. He accepted it, because he always accepts what we tell him. He trusts the boundary of the glass. Elian swallowed hard. The memory of that morning, the overly careful kisses, the long, drawn-out instructions about the solar power arrays, the final adjustment of the anchor, rushed back, sharp and painful. He had been so young, so accepting. We had to ensure his survival above all else. The outside world is closing in, consuming itself. This place, this deep, still center of the Lacus, is the only place left truly clean. The air is filtered, the water is monitored, the structure is sound. It is a refuge, not a prison, though it must feel like one now. Elian's chest tightened. He had always called it the cage, even in his own silent thoughts. A clean cage. The supplies are precisely calculated. The solar panels will last longer than we will. The food is dehydrated and sealed. He has the knowledge, the maintenance routines, the water purifier sequence. He is brilliant, our son. He understands structure and logic. He does not yet understand why logic fails when the outside world succumbs to its own toxic failure. Elian paused, lifting his gaze to the glass wall. Outside, the lake was still indigo, pristine, and the mountains silent. He had no context for the failure his parents described. All he knew was the silence they had left him in. He turned the page, the fibers sticking slightly. Entry 2. The final preparation. This journal, the letters, the box, it is a last resort. We have weighted the box heavily, using the ballast lead. We submerged it directly beneath the maintenance hatch. It will settle into the mud shelf. The hope is that it will be preserved indefinitely, awaiting the time when Elian, in his maturity, seeks to understand what lies beneath the surface of his solitude. We could not leave him a map, a key, or an instruction manual for escape. The escape is not physical, it is contextual. The knowledge of why he is here is the only key we can give him that cannot be stolen or corrupted by the toxic world we leave behind. The decision was agonizing. Leaving him to believe we simply vanished or that we are on a long, long voyage, feels cruel. But the alternative, telling him the true state of the external regions, the breakdown of infrastructure, the toxic encroachment, would break his spirit. He needs the years of isolation to grow strong, to cultivate the inner quiet that will allow him to survive the eventual truth. Elian felt a rush of heat to his face. They hadn't abandoned him. They had preserved him. The isolation was a protective shell, painstakingly engineered. He continued reading, the urgency of his father's script pouring from the damp pages, raw and immediate. Entry 3. The weight of absence. I watched him through the glass today. He was tracing the schools of minnows. He seemed content, but content is not happy. We are sacrificing our presence for his existence. I pray he understands, one day, that his life, contained within these glass walls, is infinitely more valuable than any life we could offer him outside, where the very air is becoming poison. We prepared the structure not just as a refuge, but as an observational tool. The depth of the lake here, the clarity of the water, it will provide crucial, clean data monitoring for decades. His purpose, should he choose to accept it, is to be the guardian of the clean sample, the keeper of the truth about the decline. We leave the communications array disabled, not broken, just disabled. He must not be tempted to reach out until he is ready, until he has processed this great silence. Contact will expose him prematurely to the world's sickness. Elian's eyes tracked the dense lines of text, his brain struggling to integrate the gravity of the confession. He was not just an orphan hiding in a glass house. He was the last viable sentinel of a world that had committed suicide. The floating glass house was not a home. It was a research station, a silent, submerged laboratory. He reached the final entry. The script was almost illegible here, rushed and marred by what looked suspiciously like a dried tear stain, distorting the fragile fibers of the paper. Entry 4. Goodbye. We are leaving now. The anchor is set, the buoyancy confirmed. The lake is stable. We will row north toward the restricted zones to establish the last perimeter markers. We will not return. We cannot return. We leave him everything we are, the house, the knowledge, the absolute certainty of our love. The key to everything is in the water itself. It has guarded this message. It has nurtured his environment. When he looks down, he must see not a prison, but the boundary of purity. He must look beneath the waterline and understand that the abyss below is cleaner than the air above the distant hills. Elian, my son, Do not mourn the life you might have lived. Embrace the life you have saved. The world needs a record. You are the record. J.A.C. The signature was his father's, stark and final. Elian sat back, the wet journal slipping slightly on the wool blanket. He did not cry. Crying was a luxury he rarely afforded himself. His sorrow was usually a deep, still ache. But this was different. This was not the shock of loss. It was the shock of understanding. The cold of the glass no longer felt like mere temperature. It felt like the pressure of the outside world, held at bay by the thickness of the structure. He gathered the loose letters that lay beside the journal. They were tied with the same thin black leather cordage. He separated them gently. They were addressed, in his mother's delicate flowing script, to him. The first envelope was almost dissolved, the paper inside reduced to an amorphous pulp. He moved to the second, which was protected by a slightly thicker layer of wax sealant that had resisted the water better. He opened it with the utmost care, peeling back the layers until the thick paper, still damp but intact, lay exposed. The letter was personal, addressed only to my brave keeper of the quiet. Elian, my little observer, if you are reading this, you are already strong. You have faced the water, opened the mystery, and chosen understanding over despair. This is the hardest lesson we ever taught you, and we taught it with our absence. Your father was always focused on the science, the structural integrity, the logistics of survival. I focused on the feelings. I need you to know that every time the sun hits the glass floor, every time the water shifts color, every sound of the wind across the roof, that is us. That is the environment we consecrated for your safety. We knew the solitude would be the greatest challenge, but solitude allows for true observation. I want you to look again. Not just at the minnows and the plankton, but at the way the light bends, the way the colors shift from sapphire to emerald in the shallows. Look at the distortion. The world is distorted, Elian. You are seeing clarity. We left you one thing inside the box, a small counterweight for the lead. It is something practical yet symbolic. It is the only light we could guarantee would not fail, even after years of darkness. Elian immediately looked back to the open wooden box, still sitting on the oilcloth, its interior now mostly drained. He reached inside and cleared away the last of the black mud that clung to the bottom and corners. His fingers brushed against something hard, dense, and unnaturally smooth. He pulled it out. It was an old, heavy maritime signaling lamp. It was brass, polished smooth by decades of use, then tarnished green by the water. It was small, designed to be held in the palm of the hand, sealed tight by a heavy glass lens and a rubber gasket. It had a small recessed switch. It was clearly very old, preserved as a robust artifact. He tried the switch. It moved stiffly, resistant to the years of immersion. He pressed it fully into the on position. Nothing happened. The lamp was dark. The battery, if it existed, was surely dead. He felt a momentary flicker of disappointment, which his mother's words immediately countered. It is the only light we could guarantee would not fail. She didn't mean the electricity. She meant the intent. Elian turned the lamp over in his hands. It was a tangible link to the outside world, a tool of communication, now rendered silent by the very water that had preserved his life. He returned to the letter. If you choose to leave the observatorium, and we pray you never do, this lamp is your last link to the structure. Do not use it for light, use it for memory. It is a symbol of guidance and vigilance. And one final task, my keeper. The communications array is disabled, yes, but not useless. We did not want you to send a message out, but we wanted you to be able to hear a message in if ever the outside world recovers its sanity. The antenna is located beneath the roof cowling, powered by the tertiary solar grid. It is tuned only to the pre-programmed frequency of the Northern Survey Station. We only ever listen for the data pulses. Listen, Elian. Do not transmit, just listen. Listen to the long silence and know that your life is the antidote to the surrounding noise. Elian placed the letter down, careful of the damp edges. His mother's emotional appeal and his father's scientific imperative had woven together into a singular, devastating purpose. He spent the next hour absorbing the text, rereading the journals and the surviving letters until the light began to fade dramatically, and the interior of the observatorium was filled with the deep, cold blue of the lake's reflection. The weight of the new knowledge was enormous. It transformed his view of the floating glass house from a solitary shelter into a beacon of isolated, desperate hope. He looked down at the glass floor again. The water below was no longer a beautiful distraction. It was a protective barrier. He saw the movement of the unseen currents not as chaotic motion, but as the constant, steady life force protecting his solitude. He realized the implication of the final entry. The key to everything is in the water itself. He knew the observatorium was a monitoring station. His father, the scientist, would have meticulously catalogued and preserved samples. But where? He remembered the old, thick cedar chest built into the floor near the kitchen area, always locked, always labeled simply, "Control samples, do not disturb." Elian had never disturbed it. The lock was a simple old tumbler lock. He had often wondered if a key existed. Now he understood the irony. The key was not a physical object. The key was the knowledge he had just retrieved from the lake floor. He looked at the lead weight, now sitting beside the retrieved box. It was heavy, blunt, and dense. He walked to the cedar chest. It was perhaps a meter square, recessed perfectly into the floorboards. Its surface smooth and unmarred. The lock mechanism was old, exposed brass. Elian knelt. He didn't try to force it open. He remembered a conversation with his father years ago, during a time when the world was perhaps beginning its final, swift collapse, but before the isolation. Elian, true locks are not beaten by force. They are persuaded by counterpressure and precision. Elian picked up the lead weight. It was the only dense, non-damaging object he possessed capable of delivering precision force. He examined the tumbler. It was a simple lever lock, 4 internal pins. He carefully inserted the tip of his utility knife into the keyhole. It was too flimsy to turn the mechanism, but it could act as a tension wrench. He applied the slightest pressure to the blade, holding the tension firmly against the internal springs. Then he used the pointed corner of the lead weight as a makeshift pick. With painstaking slowness, holding his breath, he began to feel for the internal pins, tapping the lead weight against the knife handle to gently shift the alignment. The lock was rusty and sticky. The first pin yielded with a tiny, nearly inaudible click. Elian's focus was absolute. He could hear his own heartbeat again, a deep, slow thudding in the silence of the house. This act was not destructive. It was the final acceptance of his parents' purpose. Second pin, click. Third pin, click. The fourth pin was stubborn, refusing to align. He adjusted the angle of the tension wrench, the utility knife, just a millimeter, then applied a slow, increasing pressure with the lead weight. Click, shink. The lock sprung open. Elian removed the knife and the weight, his hand trembling slightly. He lifted the heavy cedar lid. The chest was not filled with gold or supplies. It was filled with glass. Row upon row of meticulously catalogued, sealed glass vials, each roughly the size of a finger, stood upright in fitted foam cushioning. Each vial was labeled with thin, precise writing, dates, coordinates, and brief descriptions of the contents. Vial 1, lacquer crystalline, surface sample, April 14th. Vial 120, Northern Shore, air particulates, June 3rd. Vial 288, deep water profile, 50-meter, Aug. 19th. And in the center of the chest, slightly larger than the others, was a single heavy glass jar, sealed with a thick rubber stopper and wax. The label was stark: Lacus crystalline, post-collapse baseline, preserve at all costs. The jar contained only water, pristine and utterly clear. It was the color of liquid diamond in the fading light. This was the record, the physical manifestation of their sacrifice. Elian finally understood the true weight of the Observatorium. It was not a place to wait for rescue. It was the final, archived seed of an extinct environment. He carefully lifted the sealed jar, holding it against the remaining light from the glass walls. He could see his own reflection in the surface of the water inside the jar, a small, isolated figure framed by the cold clarity of the sample. He realized the terrifying implication of the journal entry. The world needs a record. You are the record. If he left, the physical samples would remain, but the active observation would cease. His survival was inextricably linked to the house's function. He had to check the communication array, his mother's final request. The antenna was housed on the roof, but the access panel was in the ceiling of the sleeping alcove. He retrieved the only ladder available, a lightweight folding aluminum structure kept secured near the galley. He climbed carefully, the ladder groaning under his weight, until he reached the recessed panel. He slid the panel back. Inside, nestled amongst the structural beams, was a small, dusty radio receiver, powered by an internal battery pack connected to the tertiary solar grid. It was old, built for durability, not range. The dial was locked onto a single cryptic frequency, 048 MHz. There was a small switch labeled Monitor. Elian hesitated. For 5 years he had been wrapped in absolute, perfect silence. Turning this switch meant introducing the possibility of noise, of intrusion, of the outside world breaking through the glass walls. But he had been given an instruction, a legacy. He reached up and clicked the switch firmly into the monitor position. A faint, high-pitched whine immediately filled the space, the sound of the receiver powering up. The radio was alive. Elian held his breath, waiting for voices, static, music, or the sounds of civilization. The whine faded into a soft, consistent hiss, pure, white noise, the sound of an empty frequency. The sound of distance. He listened intently, straining his ears, trying to distinguish any pattern within the static. Minutes passed. The light outside was now almost gone, leaving the interior bathed in a deep sapphire gloom, illuminated only by the faint glow reflecting off the white noise on the receiver panel. Silence. Not the silence of the lake, but the silence of the world. Then, faint, almost subliminal, Elian detected a rhythm within the hiss, a series of deep, repetitive thumps. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a voice. It was slow, measured, and mechanical. It sounded less like a signal and more like a heartbeat, or perhaps the steady, rhythmic data pulse his mother had mentioned. He tried to count the interval. It was exactly 4 seconds between each impact. It was the signal from the Northern Survey Station. It was still running. It was still measuring. The system was alive, but only transmitting cold, emotionless data pulses. This steady, unceasing rhythm was the sound of the toxic world continuing its existence, monitored by automation, devoid of humanity. Elian listened to the pulse for a long time. The cold, rhythmic beat of the dying world filling the observatorium. It was not frightening, it was merely fact. He climbed down the ladder, his legs shaky from the ascent and the emotional exhaustion. He secured the ceiling panel, silencing the sound slightly, allowing only a muffled thump-thump-thump to penetrate the alcove. He stood in the center of the observatorium, surrounded by glass, tethered to the floor by the silent rhythm of the data pulse. He looked at the ochre box, the salvaged journal, the letters, the jar of pure water, and the silent maritime lamp. He was the keeper, the observer. He walked to the main glass floor panel, the one that had allowed him to see the box below the waterline. The lake was now black, mirroring the starless night sky above. He could see nothing below, only his own reflection superimposed upon the darkness. He had hidden in the floating glass house, protected by its fragility. What he had seen below the waterline, not the object, but the purpose contained within it, changed everything. He was no longer waiting for rescue. He was waiting for the world to heal itself, and until that distant, perhaps impossible day, he would observe, he would record, he would preserve the baseline. Elian picked up the lead weight. It was heavy and cold in his hand. He carried it to the sleeping alcove, placing it carefully beneath his pallet. He placed the journal and the letters, now slightly drier, beside it. The glass house had always been his prison. Now, armed with the crushing yet comforting truth of his parents' sacrifice, it was his fortress, his legacy, and his lonely, beautiful commitment to the future he might never see. He lay down, fully clothed, upon the crisp, cold sheets, pulling the heavy wool blanket over him. The sounds of the structure settling against the water were different now. They were not sounds of loneliness, but sounds of vigilance. The house was breathing, watching, keeping the cold, clear secret of the lacus crystalline. Elian closed his eyes, listening to the muffled, steady thump, thump, thump from the radio, the sterile heartbeat of the distant world, and felt, for the first time in his life, profoundly and terrifyingly responsible. And in that responsibility he found a fierce, quiet peace that the vastness of the lake could finally match. He was Elian, the keeper of the quiet, and his work had just begun.